Hey everyone, C-Stan here with the Lord of the Rings The Living Card Game. Today I've got something a little different. Instead of a playthrough video, I'm going to be going through a guide to action windows. So, in the Lord of the Rings The Living Card Game, there's many action windows. They can be very confusing, especially as a new player, when you are allowed to do certain things. And I figured it was time for someone to put out a guide to help especially new players understand all these tricks and timing issues in order to improve their gameplay strategy or potentially correct rule mistakes that they're doing. But I also want this to be useful to advanced players too. So I've included a lot of interesting kind of tricks that I personally use um, with certain cards and certain action windows that are not typically seen in a game, but can be really valuable. Um, Potentially, maybe you haven't seen them before, and they can be helpful going forward. Um, but in general, I want to make this a guide that is clear and easy to understand, and hopefully help all sorts of players with dealing with a very complex issue of action windows in the Lord of the Rings, the card game. So first of all, let's go over what an action window is. So uh, it has a good definition in the rules reference that came out this year. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend checking it out. It's sort of a glossary on like all these different things in the game that can really clear things up. Um, but here's what it says about an action window. So, an action ability may only be triggered during an action window. When an action window opens, the first player has the first opportunity to initiate an action or pass. Opportunities to initiate actions then proceed in player order until all players consecutively pass, at which point the action window closes and the game advances to the next step on the timing chart. Note that if a player passes his or her opportunity to act, but all other players do not consecutively pass in sequence, the original player may still take an action when the progression of action opportunities comes back around to that player. Resolve each action completely before the next action opportunity. So that's a lot of text just to clarify the finer points around action windows. But essentially, when an action window opens up, you can pretty much go in whatever order you want, because you can say that like player 1 does something and then player 3 does something else, comes back to player 2. It only ends once everyone passes. So that can be helpful to know. Um, but what's more important is where these action windows show up and when you're actually allowed to do this. So it mentioned a timing chart. That timing chart is also in the rules reference here. So round begins, and it lists all the steps of the round. So there's a lot. And you can see at various places there's action windows, and those are the moments where you can perform actions. What I've done here in this Rings DB deck is copied all the text into the deck description. And at each action window, I've discussed a little bit about what I typically use this window for, why it's useful, and I give some examples of certain cards that I typically play and the strategy behind playing those cards. And I've removed a lot of the other unnecessary details in terms of action windows from the timing chart, and just left the name of the step. So we're going to go through this, and I'll stop at each action window and have a little discussion on it. So here we go. So the round begins in the resource phase. You don't have an opportunity to act yet. You just need to collect your resources, draw your cards, and then after that, you do have an action window. And one example of a card that you can only play in this action window is Captain's Wisdom. So Captain's Wisdom says resource action. Exhaust a noble hero you control to add 2 resources to that hero's resource pool. So since it says resource action, that means you can only perform it during the action window in the resource phase, and that's where we are right now. So because this action window takes place before the planning phase, you haven't had the opportunity to actually play any cards yet. So you couldn't, for example, play down Heir of Mardil, where the attached hero after the attached hero gains any number of resources from a card effect. Exhaust Heir of Mardil to ready attached hero. You can't play this down and then follow it up with Captain's Wisdom, because you can't play Heir of Mardil until the planning phase, and you have to play Captain's Wisdom in the resource phase. It would work if you played Heir of Mardil on a previous round and now you're playing Captain's Wisdom. You would be able to make use of this combo. But as for like starting out turn 1, you can't. Any other generic actions, of course, can be performed here. One of the actions that I like to do is play Heed the Dream in this action window to actually search out for Captain's Wisdom in my top 5 cards. Because if I wait for a later action window to grab that, I won't be able to play it. Another action I might do in this action window is play Sneak Attack with Gandalf. So since Sneak Attack only lasts for the phase, at the end of the phase I'm going to pull back Gandalf back into my hand. So I'll get to make use of the response on Gandalf to maybe draw 3 cards, and then pull him back to my hand, and then I'll get to play him again normally in the planning phase. So that gets me a little extra use of Gandalf's response. Whereas if I wait until the planning phase, I won't be able to play Sneak Attack and play Gandalf normally all in the planning phase, because Sneak Attack will last until the end of the phase. So that about sums it up for the resource phase. Once it ends, the planning phase begins, and the planning phase consists of this special action window. The special action window is a regular action window in the sense that anyone can perform actions, but it also gives you the ability to play down allies and attachments from your hand. So this goes in player order from player 1, 2, 3, 4 if there are 4 players. And this is typically the only time in the game where you'd be able to play down attachments and allies. So that's why it's called a special action window. So the action, as I mentioned, the allies and attachments, they need to be played in player order 1, 2, 3, 4. But the generic actions you might do, like any sort of event or ally with an action ability, those can be done in any order. So here's an example of what is allowed and what isn't, just to clear things up. So let's say it's player 1's turn to play allies and attachments. And player 2 plays a Deep Knowledge, which says Doom 2, each player draws 2 cards. So everyone draws 2 cards. Player 1 then draws into an ally that they want to play. Player 1 is allowed to play it because it is still their turn to play allies and attachments. However, consider this other scenario where it's player 2's turn to play allies and attachments. Player 2 plays down Gleowine, who has an ability action, exhaust Gleowine to choose a player. That player draws 1 card. If you trigger Gleowine and target player 1 to make player 1 draw a card, and they draw into an ally that they want to play, they can no longer play it that round, because they've already passed their opportunity to play allies and attachments to player 2. So here's another example. Let's say it's player 1's turn to play allies and attachments, and they have a 2-cost ally that they really want to play, but don't have enough resources. So they pass, and now it's player 2's turn to play allies and attachments. Player 2 decides to play Steward of Gondor onto one of player 1's heroes, so that player 1 can trigger the action. So remember, actions can be performed in any order. So as soon as player 2 plays Steward Gondor onto player 1's hero, player 1 can immediately use that action and gain 2 resources. However, since they've already passed their opportunity to play allies and attachments, they can't use the resources they've just gained from that to play an ally or attachment that turn. So hopefully that clears up the special action window in the planning phase. Then, once the planning phase ends, you begin the quest phase. After the quest phase begins, there's an action window. And this is important because this action window occurs before you commit characters to the quest. So this is why you're allowed to play Sneak Attack Gandalf in the quest phase and then quest with Gandalf. So this is the action window where you would do that. It is also the only time where you can play Gildor's Council. Gildor's Council says play during the quest phase before characters are committed to the quest. So this is a specific action with a further limitation that it needs to be in this specific action window, because there are other quest actions. There are other action windows in the quest phase, so they couldn't have written quest action because it needs to be in this specific action window within the quest phase. Okay, so then you commit characters to the quest, and after committing, but before revealing cards in the staging step, you have another action window. And I would say this action window doesn't get used very often. I tried to come up with a couple little tricks that you could do here. So let's say you have risk some light in your hand, where it says look at the top 3 cards in the encounter deck. You may select one card and move it to the bottom of the encounter deck. Return any unselected cards to the top of the encounter deck in any order. So let's say you were 1 resource short of being able to play this card. And then you commit Theodred to the quest. After Theodred commits to the quest, choose a hero committed to the quest, add 1 resource to that hero's resource pool. So you could add it to a lore hero's resource pool, assuming you quested with your lore hero, and then you'd be able to afford risk some light. And then this is the time where you would want to play it, because you want to play it before you start revealing cards. Another example could be that you're playing with Furial, who says response after Furial commits to the quest, look at the top card of the encounter deck. Then you may discard the looked at card. So let's say you've done that, and you see, oh, it's a nasty treachery. So you could discard it with Furial, but you could also use this action window to maybe send a resource to a spirit hero so that you can play Test of Will and cancel it instead and pretty much nullify one of the cards revealed this round. So just, yeah, basically a lot of the reasons you would do actions here would be like related to seeing cards in the encounter deck. This is also the only action window where Battle Fury can be played. Battle Fury says play only before the staging step. This actually means play only immediately before the staging step. You go exhaust a hero you control to immediately declare it as an attacker and resolve its attack against any eligible enemy target. Then the players as a group may spend 1 spirit resource to commit that hero to the quest. Okay, then you have staging. And it's important to note here that as you're revealing cards off the top of the encounter deck, there aren't typically action windows. So if you've turned up, say, a Necromancer's Reach that's going to damage all your characters, all your exhausted characters, you can't like interrupt it and perform readying actions so that they don't get damaged or anything like that. Or for example, you couldn't heal someone who was like 1 away from dying in the middle of the staging step. So it's important to note the places where there aren't action windows, just as it is important to note where there are. Now we come to the action window after staging, and I would say this is one of the most important action windows for new players to learn. I know myself, it took me a little while to learn this action window, and when I finally did, I was blown away at what you could actually do here. So this action window crucially occurs before quest resolution. Quest resolution is the point at which you compare how much willpower you committed to the quest to how much threat is in the staging area. So the fact that there's an action window here means you can perform any number of actions to adjust your willpower after you see how much threat has been revealed in the staging step, but before you resolve the quest. So for example, uh, Spirit Eowyn. You discard one card from your hand to give Eowyn +1 willpower until the end of the phase. This may be triggered by each player once each round. You don't need to do this before committing her to the quest or right after committing her to the quest. You can wait to see how much threat has been revealed in the staging step before deciding how much you want to discard to Eowyn's ability. So this is really important because you could kind of decide after the fact that, like, well, you don't want to advance yet, or um, you are one short of tying the threat, and so you only need to discard one card if you want to tie. So this is really important for that. The same goes for any card that can boost your willpower through an action. So Protector of Lorien can do that. Um, you could play Secret Paths at this point to choose a location in the staging area until the end of the phase. That location does not contribute its threat. So you can play this here. So in the same way you can boost your own boost your own willpower. You can also play cards to reduce threat of cards in the staging area. Nenya allows Galadriel to add her willpower to another character's willpower, so that can help you get more willpower on the quest. You can also play Bofur here, so he has a quest action. Spend one spirit resource to put Bofur into play from your hand, exhausted and committed to a quest. If you quest successfully this phase and Bofur is still in play, return him to your hand. So this is great because, say, if you're short by 3, you could spend one to put Bofur into play, and now you're only short by 1, so you only have to raise your threat by 1, and you get to keep Bofur around for the rest of the game. Whereas if you were to do this before the staging step, you might not really get a good idea of whether or not you're going to be able to keep him around for future turns if you don't know how much threat you're going to turn up. So this is definitely the ideal place to play Bofur. Cards like Hobbit Pony, where you can, it says quest action, if attached hero is not committed to the quest, exhaust Hobbit Pony and attached hero to commit attached hero to the quest. So that again allows you to commit a Hobbit to the quest after you've seen what cards get revealed in the staging step. Some other cards, Grappling Hook, similar to Hobbit Pony, allows you to commit someone. Elrond's Cancel allows you to boost willpower. So there's a million cards. I could go on and on, but I think you get the idea here. Definitely take good advantage of this action window to adjust your willpower and staging threat in order to quest successfully. Okay, so after quest resolution, there's another action window. Okay, so this one's a bit of a weird one. So there aren't actually many times where doing an action here would make more sense than doing the same action just like in the action window immediately previous to this. There are corner cases, so I came up with one that, so for example, let's say in quest resolution where you place progress tokens, let's say you just advanced to the next quest stage. There could be something that shows up at the beginning of the next quest stage where you want to play an action to react to it before you get into the travel phase. So one example is in Flight of the Stormcaller, you could end up advancing to a next stage that puts Water Spout into play. So one of the one of the stages in Flight of the Stormcaller puts Water Spout um, into play. And um, what Water Spout does is the important thing here is if your heading is at the worst setting, when faced with the option to travel, the players must travel to Waterspout if able. And it says forced after traveling to Waterspout, deal 4 damage to each ship objective. So let's say you advance the quest, this popped out, and you're at the worst setting. So this is not good because you're going to have to travel here and deal 4 damage to all your ships. So this action window here would crucially allow you to play a card like Evening Star to place progress on that location, or Heirs of Yorendil to discard that location from play so that you're not going to be forced to travel to there. Because as we'll see in a second, there is no action window in the travel phase before you're forced to travel. So if you want to do that, you have to do that here. Okay, but personally, apart from corner cases like that, I think the most common action I do here in this window is with Spirit Bofur. So here's sort of an advanced tip. I know I said that Bofur is really good to play here because you've figured out how much willpower you've committed, and if you're a little bit short, you can potentially play Bofur and keep him around for the rest of the game. However, there might be cases where you are only short by 1 willpower, or you're short by 0, as in you've tied the threat in the staging area. In this case, if you play Bofur in this action window, your willpower will go up by 2 and you'll quest successfully, forcing Bofur back to your hand. But you'll notice Bofur just says quest action. It doesn't say what action window in the quest phase you have to play him in. So it's up to you. And in cases where you're only short by 1 willpower, or you've tied the threat in the staging area, you can be beneficial to play Bofur in this action window, because his +2, because in quest resolution you've already finalized whether or not you quested successfully or not. So if you were short, take for example, you were short by 1 willpower, you go into quest resolution, you failed the quest, you raise your threat by 1. Now in this action window, you play Bofur. And since resolution is already done, his +2 willpower that he commits to the quest doesn't all of a sudden turn it into a successful quest. You've already failed it. So it's basically a way to play Bofur for 1 cost, and you get to keep him around for future turns. Because you've still technically, you have not quested successfully. And in the case where you tie the quest, well, if you're a new player, you might not know this, but when you tie the quest, it doesn't count as questing successfully or questing unsuccessfully. So in cases where you tie, you have not quested successfully, so Bofur still gets to stay in play. Okay, so that's it for the quest phase. We will go into the travel phase, and as I mentioned, there's no action window before you are forced to travel. You can only do actions after traveling. And that's why if you take a look at a card like Mariner's Compass, it says response at the beginning of the travel phase. Exhaust Mariner's Compass and attach character to search the top 5 cards in the encounter deck for a location. Switch that location with a location in the staging area. Shuffle the encounter deck. So the reason this couldn't be an action, is because there's no action at the beginning of the travel phase. So they had to make it a response, saying a response at the beginning of the travel phase, so that it allowed you to trigger it there. Other than that, I don't have a lot to say about the action window in the travel phase. I think it's fairly straightforward. You can play whatever actions you want. Okay, so encounter phase. When the encounter phase begins, we first have optional engagement. So this is where you get to optionally engage one enemy or not. So this is also the point at which cards like Hammerstroke, so engage each enemy in play, you might want to play that there to prevent well, you could play it in the later action window as well. But if you want to engage every enemy, sure. Um, it would definitely be the action window to be playing cards that help you avoid engagement, so noiseless movement. Choose an enemy in the staging area. That enemy does not make engagement checks this round. Then, if your threat is 20 or less, and this is the first time you played a copy of Noiseless Movement this round, return it to this card to your hand instead of discarding it. So you kind of need to play this in this action window because the forced engagement checks occur right after it. So at that point, playing Noiseless Movement after forced engagement checks isn't really going to do anything because you've already had to engage it. So same with cards like Advanced Warning, where until the end of the phase, enemies do not make engagement checks. Or Grey Cloak, which again helps you avoid engaging an enemy. These are all cards that you would want to play in this action window in the encounter phase. Meanwhile, after forced engagement checks, you get another action window. And I guess what's important about this one is it's the last action window before the combat phase. So if you're not familiar with the concept of archery, archery is direct damage that gets applied to your characters right at the beginning of the combat phase, before you have an opportunity to perform an action. So if you want to heal off characters before you have to deal with archery, this is the last action window where you could do so. It's also the only action window where arrows from the trees can be played. This says in encounter action play only after making engagement checks. So what it does isn't important, but basically that's the only time you'd be able to play that card. Okay, now we get to the combat phase. So this is a really exciting phase for action windows, as you can see. So let's work our way through it here. Combat phase begins, as I mentioned, this is where archery gets applied. So you know you can't perform actions in the combat phase before that point. Then you deal shadow cards. Again, you can't perform actions in the combat phase before you dealt out the shadow cards. So if you're playing, for example, a quick strike in the combat phase, that enemy will already have a shadow card dealt to them. Okay, so after shadow cards are dealt, you do have an action window. So again, archery damage is applied here. So what it means is you can't do a trick like play sneak attack and play down an ally in the combat phase and then have that ally absorb archery damage. If you've done that, then you've sort of broken a rule. You can only sneak in after combat, the phase begins and the archery damage gets applied. Similarly, you can't do Prince Imrahil's combat action to search the top 5 cards of your deck for an ally and put it into play. You have to do that after archery damage gets applied. Okay, important to note that this action window occurs even if no enemies made attacks during the combat phase. What else? We have some of the most common actions performed here are stuff like feint, where we stop an enemy from attacking. We want to do this here because well, we don't want to wait until enemies have started attacking because then feint doesn't help. Same with Thicket of Spears. To avoid enemy attacks, you need to play that here. Haldir of Lorien, if you want to snipe out an enemy before it has a chance to make an attack, this is where you would perform his combat action. Not really necessary to do it here, but I don't see why you would want an enemy to attack, but there may be cases. It's also the only time you can play Tireless Hunters. Tireless Hunter says play only before the resolving enemy attack step. So that's the next step here. So you have to play it right now. And this allows you to choose an enemy not engaged with you, engage that enemy, then discard a shadow card from that enemy if able. Alright, so let's say you've done all your actions here, and now you're ready to deal with enemy attacks. So when an enemy attacks, it opens up several action windows. So after these sort of interim steps, you get to perform actions, and these are important. So let's work with the first enemy attack, say. When the enemy attack initiates, This is where you, as a player, choose the enemy that's attacking. And what's really important here is that it still technically activates this action window even if the enemy attacking you is super obvious. For example, let's say we have a Haradrim Elite. Um, the Haradrim Elite, when Haradrim Elite enters play, it makes an immediate attack from the staging area against the first player. So if you've revealed this guy in the quest phase, he's going to make immediate attack against you. And in that case, it's kind of obvious uh, which enemy it is. However, you still technically do this step. And that's really important because let's say you had your defender exhausted when this Haradrim Elite comes out. This action window, since it occurs before you declare defender, gives you a chance to ready your defender in response to this enemy attack. So let's say you have Boromir. You can, where you have action, raise your threat by 1 to ready Boromir. You can perform this action now to ready Boromir so that he's ready to be declared as a defender against the enemy attack. So this is important. Otherwise, you might think that like, well, oh my defender's exhausted. I'm gonna have to like take it undefended or something. No, you have a chance to ready whatever defender you want. So cards like Unexpected Courage or Narya can be used here to ready a defender. Narya, it says exhaust Narya and attached character to choose and ready up to 2 allies. Each of those allies gets +1 attack and defense until the end of the phase. Okay, so that's super important. Now we declare defender. So this is where you'd say, okay, now I declare Boromir as a defender, and the act of declaring the defender normally requires exhausting that defender. And then after you exhaust your defender, you have another action window before you reveal the shadow card. So this would be your last window where you could use where you could get a useful effect, I should say, out of a shadow card discarding action. So what's a shadow card discarding action? Well, they appear on cards like Gandalf's Staff, where it says action, exhaust Gandalf's Staff to choose one. And one of the options is discard a shadow card from a non-unique enemy. Or Rider of Rohan, where you transfer him to another player and then discard a shadow card dealt to an enemy you are engaged with. So you need to perform these now before you get to the next step where you reveal and resolve the shadow effect. Because as soon as you reveal that shadow effect, you apply it. So it's too late at that point to use Gandalf's Staff to discard it. It's already been applied. Another useful tip here is if you have the ability to ready your defender, so let's say Unexpected Courage, Boromir, Narya, as I talked about, it can be often, but not always, wise to do that now. So you exhaust Boromir in declaring him a defender, and then immediately ready him before revealing and resolving the shadow effect. The reason for this is the shadow card may say something like the defender cannot ready for the rest of the round. So you definitely want to use your readying effect now so that in case that shadow card comes up, you're already ready and you can perform an additional action. Because it sucks to be stuck with an exhausted character with a ready Unexpected Courage and not be able to use it. Okay, so now we get to reveal and resolve shadow effect. So once you've revealed, you instantly apply it. Now this is another really important action window for new players. So as I mentioned in the quest phase, there's the action window which allows you to adjust your willpower after seeing what has turned up that round. And I keep saying it's really important. It is really important. It can mean success or fail in some cases. So this action window in the combat phase is very analogous to that action window in the quest phase because it allows you to adjust your defense before having to determine the combat damage. So let's say you turn up a shadow effect that gives the attacking enemy +1 attack. and all of a sudden now you weren't expecting this, and it's going to do enough damage to kill your hero. You can jump in here with an action like discard a card to Protector of Lorien to give your hero +1 defense, or you could play Blade Mastery. Choose a character until the end of the phase. That character gains +1 attack or +1 and +1 defense. So you gain a defense. You could even trigger the ability on Dunedain Warning and transfer that Dunedain Warning, which gives a hero +1 defense, to the hero that's defending the attack so that they get that +1. These are all legal moves here and can really save you from losing a hero in some cases. Another important action could be if your defender is damaged. You have the opportunity here to heal them, do a healing action. So if this attack you just found out from the shadow effect, it's going to um, deal the last couple damage that your hero has, you could jump in here and do a healing action so that once you apply the damage, the combat damage, they're not dead. Okay, the careful thing though to worry about here is in regards to healing your defender after seeing the shadow card, is that there can be shadow effects that say, maybe the shadow effect says deal 1 damage to the defending character. So if you only had 1 health left on your defender and you revealed the shadow effect and said deal 1 damage, well, that's it. You've got to apply it instantly. It says reveal and resolve, so you don't have time to do an action to heal your hero so that they can survive that 1 direct damage. So it's a bit of a give and take in terms of whether or not you want to see if you want to use your healing for someone else that needs it, or if you want to heal preventatively just in case a direct damage shadow effect gets turned up. Okay, now one cool trick here in this action window is if you've revealed a nasty shadow effect uh, let's say it's going to end up killing your hero. Remember, it's not actually too late to do an action that kills the enemy. So you could play Quick Strike and uh, and within this action window declare an attack against that enemy and kill that enemy. If you succeed in killing that enemy, the rest of this fizzles. You don't actually end up going to determine combat action. The attack just ends there. So it can definitely be a lifesaver and sort of an emergency button that you can press. Like are if you know that the defense you're about to do is kind of risky and might kill your hero if the enemy gets +1 attack. It can sometimes be worth doing it knowing that you have Quick Strike in hand and that if that shadow effect does turn up, you're able to kill the enemy. And this works for direct damage effects like Skyward Valley. If you are able to deal damage and kill the enemy here, you can potentially save the life of your defender. I once played a game with someone who, after revealing the shadow effect and finding that it was going to kill their hero, essentially the shadow effect said, this attack is now going to be undefended, so you're not going to be able to apply any defense to it. What he did was he played sneak attack in this action window to sneak in a White Tower Watchman. So White Tower Watchman says if each hero you control belongs to the same sphere of influence, you may assign damage from undefended attacks to White Tower Watchman instead of a hero you control. And he did have all his heroes belonging to the same sphere of influence, so he was able to redirect that undefended attack to the White Tower Watchman and save a hero because of this action window. Okay, now we get to the next step of combat, where you determine the combat damage. So this is where you actually apply damage to your character that's defending. So this is kind of similar to the post-quest action window where I said there aren't really a whole lot of uses. The only real thing I could think of was like really a corner case thing. Um, but I'm not going to go into detail. There's there's really not a lot of uses for this action window. Um, okay, so the rest of the enemy attacks get resolved. So you basically repeat all those action windows for every enemy. And then we move to where players declare their attacks. So now we get to declare an attack. So a player initiates, so you declare the enemy you're attacking and all the attackers you're going to be attacking with. And then someone else gets to jump in with ranged if they want, and there's an action window here. So this is where you would perform um, actions to boost your attack. So like say Gondorian fire would be would something where you can increase the total attack strength of your heroes. There's a million different cards that can do this, so I didn't really list them here. But Blade Mastery is a typical one from the core set, which would apply. Um, so you want to do this before you determine your attack strength. So then you go to determine its attack strength. You add up all your attack. There's another action window here, and I gotta say I can't think of a single time in like 6, 7 years of playing this game where I've ever used this action window. It's super hard to think of a single case where you would ever do it because um, adding to your attack strength here doesn't really do anything. You've already determined your attack strength. So this doesn't. So playing an attack boosting thing here doesn't really. Yeah, it doesn't really do much. Um, I think you can safely ignore this action window for now, and that's pretty much the only one where I can really say that. But yeah, I've just never used this action window. If you have a good idea of an action where you would want to perform it here, and crucially, it's actually more valuable to perform it here than any other action window, like there or there, then let me know. But I couldn't really think of a one that comes up regularly. Okay, so then we determine combat damage. And there's another action window here. The important thing about this one is that it's going to be, assuming like this is the last attack you're declaring, it's going to be the last action window before the refresh phase. So this will be the action window where you might want to trigger cards like Henemarth Riversong, where you can exhaust Henemarth to look at the top card of the encounter deck. So if Henemarth is still ready at this point, you want to exhaust him now so that you can look at the next card that's coming off in the next round. Because all your characters and cards are about to ready in the refresh phase, so you might as well do it now. Same with a card like Gleowine, where you can exhaust Gleowine to draw a card. Okay, finally we come to the last phase of the round, the refresh phase. Okay, so you'll notice there's no action windows for quite some time. So we ready all our cards, we raise our threat, we pass the first player token, and then we can perform an action window. Perform an action in this action window. So it's important to note that it comes after the threat raise. Why is this important? Because for threat reduction purposes, let's say you're at 49 threat at the end of the combat phase, and you're planning to perform some threat reduction action in the refresh phase. For example, Aragorn's once per game ability, where it says refresh action, reduce your threat to your starting threat level, limit once per game. You won't be able to do this. If you're at 49 at the end of the combat phase, you're going to hit 50 right here and instantly lose before you get a chance to perform Aragorn's ability. So I think it's common for I know I did it myself for new players to kind of lump together all the sort of like end of round and beginning of round stuff, like mesh it all together. So you like ready your cards, raise your threat, pass the token, draw a new card, gain resources. it can be tempting to kind of blend the refresh phase in with the resource phase and kind of just perform actions whenever. But sometimes it can be really important. So yeah, like as I said, for Aragorn's once per game ability. Um, some of the pluses to having the action window occur here after readying all the cards are found in cards like Gandalf. So Gandalf gets discarded at the end of the round, so he doesn't get discarded until here. So he actually readies, and he's going to be sitting around ready until he disappears. You can take advantage of that. You could, for example, use a very good tail, where you exhaust 2 allies you control to shuffle your deck and discard the top 5 cards. Put up to 2 allies discarded by this effect into play under your control. The total cost of the allies put into play cannot exceed the total cost of the allies exhausted to pay for this effect. So since Gandalf's disappearing anyway, it doesn't really hurt to exhaust him here, because he's a great ally to use with a very good tail. He's very expensive. So this essentially allows you to get extra work from buying such a pricey ally. So you get to use him regularly during the round, but then in the refresh phase you get another exhaust out of him. You could also use a word of command, exhaust an Astari character to search your deck for 1 card and add it to your hand, shuffle your deck. So might as well exhaust Gandalf here. Range of Cardolan is another ally that he reads response. After you engage an enemy, if you control at least 1 Dunedain hero, spend 1 resource to put Range of Cardolan into play from your hand under your control. At the end of the round, if Ranger of Cardolan is still in play, shuffle it into its owner's deck. So again, note end of the round there. You'll get to use him in the refresh phase before he disappears. Okay, moving on. It's common to use Steward of Gondor in the resource phase because that's when, or the planning phase, because that's when you're going to be spending your resources to play stuff. It can be really important to know that Steward of Gondor is readied and can be used in the refresh phase. Why would you want to do that? Well, for example, you may have a card you want to play in the refresh phase that you could only afford by using Steward. So let's say you had Peace and Thought, where it says cost 1 card that says refresh action, exhaust 2 heroes to draw 5 cards. So if you had no resources, you couldn't play this card. Whereas if you realize that Steward of Gondor is already ready at this point and can be exhausted here, you can generate 2 resources on a lore hero, say, and have enough resources to play Peace and Thought in the refresh phase. But okay, keep in mind that Steward of Gondor is not going to ready again in the beginning of the next round, so that's it until you get to the next refresh phase. Okay, and then finally note that the next action window after this one is in the next round. So if you've gained any resources, and that'll be after gaining resources and drawing cards. So let's say the prime example I think of when trying to think of when this would really apply is, let's say you have Erastore as one of your heroes. Okay, I think I linked the wrong Erastore. Yeah, I meant to link Erastore Hero. Erastore Hero has the ability, if you draw additional cards at the beginning of the resource phase. So here, draw 3 additional cards at the beginning of the resource phase. At the end of the round, discard all cards in your hand. So at the end of the round, you're going to discard all your cards. And then take a look at Galdor of the Havens. So Galdor of the Havens says, well, his response isn't important for the point I'm trying to make. The action is, though. So action, if you have no cards in your hand, draw 6 cards. Limit once per game. So naively, one might assume that after Erastore discards your hand, you can trigger Galdor of the Havens to draw 6 new cards. But the problem is, Galdor of the Havens is an action, so you discard your hand here at the end of the round, and the next action doesn't occur until here after you've drawn cards for the next round. So you have no sort of window while your hand is empty to trigger Galdor's effect. So yeah, those two heroes don't interact in the best way, but obviously there's still ways to empty your hand. Like you could play the cards that you drew, or discard them, and then trigger Galdor's ability. But my point was only that these Galdor and Earstore don't work in the optimal way that one might expect, without delving into the details of how the action windows work out. Okay, and then finally, out of sequence windows. The important thing here that I wanted to mention is when an enemy like the Radram Elite, which I mentioned before, where you reveal them and they make an immediate attack from the staging area. Just the one note to put there is the fact that normally you don't have action windows during staging, so if the Radram Elite comes out during staging and makes an attack against you, you might think that like you don't get action windows like a typical combat, but you do. So whenever an attack against you is initiated, you go to this here, this 6.4b, and you get to do all these action windows. So this can, in a way, it can open up action windows during staging in the rare case where an enemy makes an immediate attack against you. And you can exploit this. For example, you could like heal up. You could do things unrelated to combat in these action windows. So the Radram Elite attacks you, and you decide, well, based on what the previous card was, my characters are now damaged, and I can't really survive another blocking wards or something like that, so I'm going to heal up a bunch of my characters. You can do that in this action window where the enemy is attacking you. It doesn't have to be strictly related to attacking combat type actions. So that's just one thing to keep in mind with out of sequence attacks. And there are quite a few quests that have out of sequence attacks, like a boss enemy that attacks you in the quest phase is quite common, or a boss enemy that attacks you at the end of the round. Those will all open up a set of action windows just like a regular attack. Okay, so that about sums it up for the action window guide. If you have any particular tips or tricks for certain actions, please feel free to let me know. I think probably the best place to put that would be in the comment section of this deck. So I'm going to publish this as sort of not a real deck, but it'll still be accessible on RingsDB, and you can comment any of your suggestions there. And if you have a particularly good tip or trick, I'll put it in the sequence and credit you. So yeah, I hope if you're a new player, you've learned a lot about the different action windows and how to take full advantage of them towards winning more often. And if you're an advanced player, well, I hope one of my tips was one that you hadn't heard of before, so that you've gained something out of this video. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and as always, happy questing.